presentation. I'll just dismiss the recording in progress thing. Well, thank you very much, Matt, for that kind invitation. Really great to be here. I've obviously crossed paths with this community many occasions, many times a year. Between spaces, scopes, and scales, what the scaling frameworks don't tell you. So this isn't going to be an hour and a half of me, or it's not going to be an hour and a half long either, but it's not going to be, like a long period of me just sort of bashing the scaling frameworks. I don't think that's particularly constructive. It's certainly not the way I would want to spend an evening. I might let a snarky comment slip just occasionally, once in a while. But actually what we're really trying to get to is some of the sort of deep magic of organization. And I think there is some important theory of organization. I'm not going to cover all of it today, but it's some important things about organization that's been known for a very long time. But there's a lot of people trying to do big things, trying to do great things with Agile. And I don't blame them for trying. But when you're trying to do something as big and risky and perhaps even violent as a big Agile rollout, I think you should be aware of what you're playing with. And this is just a gentle introduction into what for me is a really fascinating model that says some really powerful things about how scaling does and doesn't work. Now, it's a model that has its origins in the last century, in the middle, 70s and 80s, and I brought it up to date, you could say, which is not to cast aspersions on the original model, but the world moves on, thinking moves on, and we just think what's happened in the Agile world, in the complexity world, and various other worlds, the organization development world as well, in the last 20 years, let alone the last 50 years. And, there's opportunity for fresh perspective, fresh presentation, and so on. So that's what I've been doing. That's where a lot of my energy has been invested in the last year or so. Now, I'm going to skip, as I said before we got going, I'm going to skip over the slide, the About Me slide. If you go to agendashift.com/keynotes, and I'll ask Matt to paste that into the Slack. There's more than enough links there in terms of links for me, my social media presences, and so on, but also all the references for my talk. And you'll be able to download a PDF of the slides. And there's also a discount code for various things as well. I'll talk about that at the end. But don't worry too much about grabbing links, grabbing titles of books or anything like that. All the references are there on agendashift.com/keynotes. So the basic challenge that we're addressing today: local problem or referred pain. You're experiencing some pain in your organization, in your process. Is that something local that you can fix? Or is this problem just a symptom of something that's happening elsewhere, a symptom of something deeper? And there's a few specific ones we're going to look at. Structures that don't seem to fit, the wrong things managed in the wrong places. Strategy is something that happens to you. A phrase I've used quite a few times over the last few years, and we talk a lot about autonomy in the Agile world. And yet it seems that strategy for many of us, too many of us, is something that just happens to us. And for those reasons and for other reasons, disappointed customers, disappointed organization, we didn't deliver what was needed, we didn't deliver what delighted our customers, or there was something about the way we did it that dissatisfied our own organization. We made some wrong decisions. Now, believe it or not, all of those problems are scaling problems, and they are scaling problems that a process-based approach on its own will fix only very slowly. These aren't actually problems of process. Your process approach, your process improvement approach may help you see that the problems are there, make them more visible, but they won't explain really what's happening. And just a little bit of extra understanding, a little bit of extra knowledge, a little bit of extra theory can help you get you to the issues a bit quicker. Now, what we're going to do, instead of taking a process-based approach, I'm going to talk about organizing, and I'm going to define organizing in a really curious way, an interesting way, a fun way, finding relationships between things in and through those mutual relationships, helping their participants, the things at the end of those relationships, realize their potential. And to help you understand that, I'm going to tell a couple of stories from my own career. I'm going to use this model with 3 relationships in it between strategy, delivery, and assurance. And you can recognize those elements in any project, any organization, or most projects, most organizations. So the first story, we're going back to 1998. And the significance of 1998 was this was the year leading up to the introduction of the euro currency for government bonds. Now, we were talking banking. I led a small development team for front office development in a leading investment bank, rewriting the P&L system for government bonds. Where it was done before in the back office systems was thought that wasn't going to survive the conversion event, where literally billions of euros worth of transactions were going to be settled. And instead we would move that to the front office so that our accounting and our risk management was done in the same way. Now, what was interesting about this project was really the strategy and the relationship of the strategy to delivery, how it influenced how the delivery happened, and how the testing was done. What the strategy was 2 things. First of all, we would do everything we could possibly do to avoid a big bang. We did parallel running. We went live instrument type by instrument type, trading book by trading book, and so on. Everything we could do to completely minimize the impact of anything going wrong, to control the pace of our rollout, and the pace of our delivery match that. One of the best afternoons development I ever did was to make the test data accessible over a web interface to our testers. It doesn't sound like a remarkable thing in 2021, but that was the first time I'd done anything like that, you know, back in 1998. So that strategy drove how we did the delivery. And the second aspect of the strategy was that they massively invested in assurance. There were way more people doing testing than there were in our development team. It was a multiple of us, 3 or 4 times number of testers compared with the number of developers. I'd never seen anything like it before or since, and it was fantastic. We actually went live a couple of weeks earlier than we originally planned, and that conversion event went remarkably smoothly. A couple of hiccups on the way. We worked really hard all year, I can tell you. But it was a strategy that worked, and it was the way we delivered was a good fit for that strategy. The way that we tested was a good fit both for the strategy and how we delivered, and so on and so on and so on. These things supported each other, and it was great. Now, fast forward 10 years, quickly do the maths, it's 2008. Now, in the meantime, that was a career, I don't know about career defining, but certainly career enabling project for me. I went on a bit of a tour around the bank. And in the end of those 10 years, I came back to run the global department in which I'd been a developer 10 years previously. Fancy title of executive director and all the rest of it. But if you do the maths, 2008, that is the middle of the credit crisis. So I'm in the middle of the credit crisis working in fixed income securities. And that's a really uncomfortable place to be. And now I will reveal the organization as well. I was in charge of fixed income securities IT at UBS. And if you know anything about banking or the history of banking, you may remember that UBS very nearly didn't survive the credit crisis. And the reason why, they engaged one of the big consultancies to do some strategy work for them, to do a benchmarking exercise. How do we compare against our competition? And the answer came back, you're not doing enough in mortgage-backed securities. You're not doing enough in the very thing that would be at the root of the credit crisis. If you've not watched The Big Short, go and watch it. It was very educational, but also hilarious. You should really, really watch that film. Really good film. I watched it a couple of times. That strategy was enthusiastically embraced by the organization, strongly held, very enthusiastically executed. Obviously, particularly the American trading arm of the business piled into that stuff. But even in Zurich, even the Treasury Department in Zurich, you know, where they look after the gold bars and everything else, you know, they were investing in these mortgage-backed securities. And the assurance side of the business just couldn't keep up. The complexity of these instruments wasn't well understood. The sheer rate of growth of the business wasn't well understood. And when that market blew up, it very nearly killed the bank. Now, I've not broken any confidences by sharing all that. The bank actually was very transparent. To its credit, it was very transparent about what went wrong. It was, I think, scandalous, actually, some of the decisions that they made. But the problem here is the relationship between strategy, delivery, and assurance. Strategy too strongly held, such that assurance wasn't listened to. Delivery more enthusiastic again than assurance was ready for, and so on. Assurance here was the poor relation, not because they were incompetent, they really weren't, but because they felt powerless and not listened to in the face of, you know, the strength of what was happening in those other areas. So really simple model: strategy, delivery, assurance. And what's interesting about the model isn't really the contents of those circles, it's the relationships between them. Relationships of power, relationships of information, different kinds of ways to look at the relationships, and what's healthy about those relationships, what's unhealthy about those relationships. Now, if you know anything about agenda shift and leading with outcomes, faced with a nice little thing like this, what am I going to do? I'm going to be thinking, well, can we imagine what that could be like if this was working really well, working at its ideal best for us? Each relationship helping its participants toward their full potential, every element contributing to the success of the whole. When all of that is working at its ideal best for everyone, what's that like? Whose needs will we be meeting? What new stories could they tell? What stops that? What gets in the way? You probably recognize I've asked those questions many, many times over the years, not with this model as the thing to reflect on, but there's a whole raft of things that we could be reflecting on. So this is the beginning of the I-Do pattern: ideal, obstacles, outcomes. We could move on to outcomes. You know, I'm known for outcomes. Agenda shift and leading with outcomes are all about outcomes, but we're going to stop with obstacles. What stops that? What gets in the way? And there's actually some theory that can help us. So if you're into flow, yeah, perhaps you'll think the most relevant theory is queuing theory. And queuing theory is actually, you know, very interesting, very important, powerful piece of theory. Helps you understand how flow does and doesn't work, and applies to business processes. It's a good way of understanding how the performance of computer systems and how those behave under load, for example. Queuing theory, very important there. Then psychology comes to bear as well. You know, individuals and interactions over processes and tools, says the Agile Manifesto. And we're talking human beings. We're talking their motivations. You know, we're talking power relationships and things like that. So psychology's got things to say, and actually various branches of psychology: human psychology, organizational psychology, developmental psychology, and social psychology. You know, all of these things have something useful to say about how relationships work. And then if you look at where, we'll get in a moment to what's the inspiration for this model. Look at the information theory, control theory, cybernetics. You know, this is about, you know, how do systems learn and adapt? And what does that say in terms of, what does that say from an information processing point of view, from an information transmission point of view, and so on? And again, more theory that you can bring to bear on whether relationships are working well, whether they're healthy, whether they're productive. And there's complexity as well. You know, something that was barely understood, you know, in the 1970s when the model was first developed, and it's something we need to understand. Well, what does that mean now? And if we're talking relationships, complexity is definitely a factor. Talking many, many relationships between many, many things, and some of those things have autonomy. You're talking complex adaptive systems. And small changes in constraints, small changes in relationships, small changes of energy or focus, all these things, any small change may have an unexpected and profound effect on the behavior of the system, of the organization as a whole. So what stops that? What gets in the way? And what many of these lead you to are what could be described as imbalances. And this makes it sort of understandable in a way that's easily to communicate easy to have conversations with people about, easy to invite people to reflect about. So, for example, from the queuing theory, do we have a good balance between demand and capacity? If you're into lean, if you're into Kanban, you will understand that balance very well. You will care a lot about that balance, and rightly so. If you're coming at it from a psychological point of view, think about my second story, for example. A lot of that was about power. The bank had made a decision, this is what we're piling into, and everybody else followed, enthusiastically or reluctantly. Information content versus decision-making capacity. This is something that we often struggle with a lot. You're faced with an inch-thick document, for example. Is that the best way for us to kick off a piece of work? Or should we have some conversation? Should we explore or whatever? I'm not saying there's a right or a wrong there. But in a particular situation, you need to find the right balance so that the way you communicate fits the needs of the people involved. And complexity terms and cybernetic terms as well. Freedom versus constraint, that's another balance. Everything totally free is chaos. Everything unfairly constrained, well, that's not healthy either. Predictability, ambiguity, all these kinds of things as well. Difficult things to get right. So we want to nail everything down before we start, or we're going to go with just enough to make some progress. So that's the theory informing how we think about relationships between different things, between strategy, delivery, and assurance here as here, but it can be with a number of other things as well. And we can reflect on that. We can think about what's not working in those relationships, and then we can carry on to outcomes. What would you like to have happen? Then what happens? And again, then what happens? Then what happens? Starting small with signs of emergence, indicators of progress, measures of success, and beyond that, perhaps to goals and aspirations and so on. What you're generating is some quite granular information about the landscape of opportunity, the landscape of obstacles and outcomes that you can arrange into a strategy of some kind. That's what agenda shift and leading with outcomes are all about. But I'm not here to talk about leading with outcomes or agenda shift. I'm here to talk about that model with the 3 circles in it. Now, it turns out there's something a little bit off about this model. You may have realized it already. It describes projects in general. It describes organizations in general. It says very little about what it means to be a deliberately adaptive organization, or, to use an older piece of jargon, a viable organization. So what's a viable organization? The various definitions of it. I like this phrase, which I've borrowed from John Boyd, the OODA loop guy. Improving its capacity for independent action in a changing environment. I mean, John Boyd was talking about, pilots and dogfights and all those kinds of things, but that generalizes the idea of improving your capacity for independent action in a changing environment, an environment that may or may not be hostile. That's kind of not the point. What needs to change? What needs to change about this model? Well, first of all, delivery needs to become something a bit richer. Delivery, discovery, renewal. It's not enough just to keep delivering. We need to make sure we're delivering the right things, and we need to be making sure that we are still going to be in good shape a year from now, 10 years from now, renewing ourselves, improving ourselves, building capabilities, building capacities, whatever it might be, and guiding that adaptive strategy. So this is what you think it is. This is strategy, but it has some very specific responsibilities, getting the balance right between delivery and discovery and renewal, also getting the right balance between itself and the work, getting the right balance between the thinking and the doing, the planning and the execution, and so on. And lastly, mutual trust building, making sure, among other things, that we've got the context we need in order to do a great job. Whether that's the context we need to make good decisions, or the context to do some great bit of, value creating work. So we've got delivery, discovery, renewal, adaptive strategy, and mutual trust building. And they're actually really intimately related, not just arrows between them. They actually share some structure. I'm not going to reveal all the structure because we don't need it today. And one of the things I've done actually is hiding unnecessary detail until the right time. What we've got is a model that works at every scale, team of teams, cross-cutting concern, doesn't have to be a hierarchy, whole organization, in these three easily understood overlapping spaces. And that would be good and useful just in itself, but it's even more powerful than that. It actually gives us insight into what's happening between different scales. So clockwise from the front, structuring, translating, reconciling, and connecting. That's quite abstract, a little bit dry. I'm going to, rather than dive into what those mean, and what the intricacies of the model are saying, we're going to use flight levels in a few moments to illustrate what some of the dysfunctions look like, that knowing the theory can help us address. So just in summary, so this is the deliberately adaptive organization. That's the name I've given to this model in 3 spaces. It's like a 10,000-foot view on the viable system model, hiding the detail when it's not necessary to see it. It really does help explain what's happening in organizations, why they need to have what they need to have, what goes wrong in organizations, explains their dysfunctions, helps you find dysfunctions that you can do something about. Coming from leading with outcomes and agenda shift, we use it in a generative way, helping people reflect on what good could look like and what power they have to change things, to improve things, and so on. I've mentioned every scale, every scope, and so on. It can be as granular as you need it to be, as you want it to be, and that turns out in a moment to be important. It's not hierarchical, and I stress that because if you go back to the literature, you tend to read quite hierarchical examples with the disclaimer that it's not a hierarchy. But after a while, it doesn't wash if every example seems hierarchical. So I've stressed networks. I've stressed things like circular organizations, sociocracy, those kinds of more modern thoughts on organization. For this model to be useful, it has to work with 21st century organizations, not only 20th century organizations. The hierarchical organization, the functional organization, those kinds of organizations, that kind of style was best practice in 1920, not 2020. So we need to make sure, stress test it, if you like, to make sure that we can deal with more modern kinds of organizations. And we've done that work, and it's complexity conscious as well. I won't go into everything that we've done to relate this to complexity, but if you think of Dave Snowden's 3 heuristics, if you've not seen these before, fine-grained objects, how small can you go? If you've got a big challenge, break it down. If you've got a big bit of organization, break it down. Even if you've got a team, might be too big. It might be enough to look at a particular concern and how that intersects with a particular team. You might start as small as that. Disintermediation, so that's cutting out the middleman in plain English, if you like. We do a lot of that. It's about teams able to represent themselves in the strategy process, for example. And distributed cognition, we are fundamentally committed to autonomy. That's a personal commitment. That I fundamentally committed to. Matt kindly talked about the humanity that runs through like a stick of rocks through my first book, and that is there in the model here as well. It was actually there in the 1970s in the original work, if you read the original work, but it's there now. And people worry when something comes from the systems world, when there's mathematics involved, and these various other tools, that you lose that humanity. Actually quite the opposite in this case. And what we're using the maths and the science to help us reveal is how organizations actually make things worse for people and give us some ways to do something about it. So anyway, that's the theory. To bring this to life, I'm going to bring up Klaus Leopold's flight levels model, described in his great book, Rethinking Agile. I don't know how many of you have read it here, but I really wholeheartedly recommend this book. Very briefly, flight levels, you start with a team. Doesn't have to be using Kanban. I'm only using Kanban because it helps us visualize what the team is up to. Teams can deliver value on their own. They've got the authority, the autonomy, and the mix of skills for them to be able to do that. But also they can combine with other teams into value streams. And all the value streams of the organization in Klaus's model, that's flight level 1 or operations. And above that, flight level 2, level of coordination, making sure that when we're spanning multiple teams, if we need to achieve something by a certain time, that we started at the right time, for example, or that the overall, we're not overburdening one part of one team to achieve things, that the work is, reasonably balanced between the different teams and so on. And in a similar vein going up, have we got the right mix of work overall? Are we going to achieve our business objectives and within our risk appetite, for example, with the mix of work that we've got, that we're pursuing the right things, balancing our investments, matching our ambition to our growing capability? Because we expect our capability to grow, to develop as we work in a way designed to maximize visibility, to make improvements easy, and so on. So bringing Klaus's model and mind together, and the topic of the talk, local problem or referred pain. What do you do when you're experiencing pain somewhere in your system as a whole, perhaps all over your system as a whole, and it does feel like that sometimes, and you really don't understand what to do about it? It doesn't seem like something that you can fix locally, and you don't understand really where it's coming from. So I'm going to go through 4 different kinds of things that this model will help you get to the bottom of. Now, the first one is all about structure. We want structures that fit. And how do you know that your structure doesn't fit? How do you know that your structure is a problem? Well, it's when it's for too many challenges, if not all challenges, it's very hard to say to which part of the organization does that belong. If you think back to the old school functional organizations, the answer was always, well, we'll take it to the top, we'll add it to the list of projects. And that is fine, if you're prepared to pay the setup cost each time to set up a new project, and you're willing to see the loss of knowledge that goes every time a project is disbanded. 2 big expenses. And the symptom that you get very commonly is that there's like a no man's land of work that just doesn't get done. The really small stuff can get picked up, by the teams. The biggest stuff, it can find sponsors at the top of the organization, but the stuff in the middle is really hard to do. I worked with one organization where they had a 7-year plan signed off by the regulator. And for a project to get done, it either had to be on that 7-year plan or it had to be self-financing, basically within a year. That leaves a huge no man's land of things that just couldn't get done. That's a real problem. So what does a good structure look like? Now, going back to, you may recognize these words, reaching the right customers, meeting their strategic needs. That's from my outside-in strategy review, quite a popular tool. And some follow-on questions. Who are those customers? Where are they? What needs should we be meeting? Their strategic needs, that's their needs, our strategy. And when do they have those needs? You may have heard me really recommend Bob Moesta's book, Demand Side Sales 101, the when of the job story, the when of the situation of need, the when of the struggling moment. So who, where, what, when, or if you go by my friend Patrick Hoverstadt and his book, and the references in the on that page, Customer, Geography, Technology, Time. You can parse any good organization structure in those terms: customer, geography, technology time. I'll give you a little example. The healthcare system of your country. We'll take the UK healthcare system, such as it is, as an example. Customer, geography, technology, time, not necessarily in that order, but actually this order works well enough for our purposes today. So at the highest level, our health system is divided into two. There's the National Health Service, serving those customers that don't want to or can't pay for their treatment. And then there's private healthcare for those that are insured or are willing to pay out of their own pocket. So that's a very high level, two very different demographic. Well, there's an overlapping demographic there, but that does explain some of the structure of our healthcare system. The geography, where are they? Well, we have some people who come and see us at our homes. We have local clinics, district hospitals, teaching hospitals, centres of excellence, and so on. And that geographical spread is managing that tension between, well, we want services close to us, but also we want to concentrate the expertise and the equipment in the right places, not just because it's cost effective, but actually because you get better outcomes when you do. That's why we have teaching hospitals and centres of excellence and so on. Technology, that's anything that meets a need. So, for example, the different medical specialisms, for example, pediatrics, oncology, whatever. The list of fancy names just escapes me just at the moment, but you can think of those different specialisms. And time, really useful dimension time, and it works in multiple ways. So, for example, prevention, diagnosis, treatment, aftercare. You could have maternity, pediatrics, adult healthcare, geriatric medicine. And think about your accident emergency department. You need them there 24/7. And people don't work 24/7, but the accident emergency department does. And so there's a time dimension to be managed there, people working in shifts, for example. So customer, geography, technology, time, you can look at large organizations and see likely those dimensions occurring multiple times, or who, where, what, when. So that's structuring. If your organization isn't a good model of its environment, a good model of its challenges, then you've probably got a structure that doesn't fit, and you're going to pay that price every time it meets a new challenge that doesn't have a home for. If that's a familiar challenge to you, look at your organization structure. And you can use it also to help you understand why your team is where it is in its organization as well. Team Topologist talks about cognitive load, for example. You want an organization structure that helps you understand your customers, helps you understand your market, helps you understand your business environment. I'm not sure if that's actually addressed in Team Topologist, but I think it's an important part of organization structure. Next one, translating, very practical problem. I'll do this quite quickly. You've got your work moving across your boards. We're very happy that our work is flowing nicely, but it still leaves a question. How do we represent that work that's happening, at team level, at the coalface, at the front line? How do we represent that higher up? That's actually a leading question. A better question might be, do we represent that work higher up? And if the answer is yes, then how? And that's the answer to that how question now leaves to Klaus. I'm not in the Kanban design game anymore. Or should we represent that work? Does every piece of work, does every small piece of work by every team need to be visible at the top level, or even the next level? And clearly the answer is no. But what does need to be represented? Now, one way of getting to this is getting to the difference between ends and the means. Or one way to do it in a way that an agilist would recognize, what is the so that here? What's the so that of the user story? What is the so that of the job story? Why is this work important? What happens when we've got this piece of work in the hands of the customer? When we've got this work in the hands of the customer, then what happens? So this is the so that. And we might decide that rather than measuring the progress of the doing, We're going to measure the progress of our ability to meet that customer need, or measure even those needs being met. So we're talking now measures of success, indicators of progress, measures of success, measured at the high level, perhaps measured at our own level. If this piece of work is part of fulfilling our purpose, how well we are fulfilling our purpose is something that we may want to measure. So measures of progress towards our purpose, measures of success, looking backwards, leading and lagging indicators, if you like, they may be enough. It may not be necessary to represent pieces of work at the high level. So that's I have seen it that portfolio boards and so on are trying to do far too much, trying to manage too much detail, and that gets into a whole list of dysfunctions, micromanagement, for example. People that should be managing the ends part of this question, instead focusing on the means more than they should do, taking away the autonomy and expertise of the people closest to the work. And perhaps they're leaving the end result, the customer result, the business results that they want, they're leaving those unmanaged. Benefits realization is something that's ignored, or that they give it to the wrong people, the people doing the doing work, people that have actually no real influence on business outcomes. That is actually setting people up for failure. That is another that's another dysfunction. That's translating. Next one is actually, before we get into reconciling, kind of in the gap between translating and reconciling, I'm just going to mention OKR as an efficient summary of strategy. And it relates back to translating in terms of we got measures of progress. For OKR, I really like to go back to a 1983 book by Andy Grove, a classic book, High Output Management. So he was the CEO of Intel, and he's like the father of OKR. Now, he didn't use the acronym OKR, but he did say this. This is almost verbatim from his book. OKRs, not using the acronym, need only to answer two questions. Where do we want to go? And how will we pace ourselves to see if we're getting there? And the answer to those questions, this is his words, provide the objective and the key results. Very simple, very efficient summary, at least, of strategy. I don't think it's the whole story of a strategy, but you do see here what it is we're trying to achieve, the ends, if you like, and how we are pacing ourselves to get there. That's a bit more about needs. So reconciling that's about reconciling the strategies of related groups, related teams that are peers of each other. Perhaps one is dependent on another, upstream or downstream of another, and also relationships up and down the scaling structures as well, between flight level 1 and flight level 2, 2 and 3, for example. And the question arises when you're surprised. Something didn't go as you expected, or a neighbor has changed a strategy in a way that you are surprised by. And the important thing here is to work out, well, what does that mean? What does it mean for us? What does it mean for those around us? And when everybody's doing that, you've got a mechanism for strategies to align, to get more coherent around your organization. I'm not saying that everything needs to be perfectly aligned, but they do need at least to be coherent. You need not to be pulling each other in opposite directions. And we should probably be doing this more often than we are. Anytime we are surprised by our own unreadiness for something. I mean, why were we surprised, for example? That means we didn't understand our neighbors or our sponsors or our customers well enough, surprised by customer feedback, surprised by a dependency that we overlooked, whatever it might be. What does that mean? What does that mean for our strategy? What does that mean for the strategies of those around us? And it's all those relationships, it's all that reconciliation happening around the organization is what keeps things coherent. It's how organizations absorb the shocks, absorb the surprises, and in the end, it's how they adapt. If your organization isn't doing this, it is probably not adapting, or not adapting quickly. You're waiting only until all your projects are finished and you think about your next projects before anything really changes. And that's a very slow learning loop. And I said before about projectized organizations, too much knowledge gets lost every time a project is disbanded anyway. So that is a real downside from a learning point of view. So this reconciliation needs to be happening frequently. Not quite all the time, but frequently. And at all these scales. So lastly, connecting, and this is actually my favorite one. I left this one till last. And this is about that uncomfortable feeling that you get when you're doing a piece of work thinking, I'm not sure I have all the context I need to do a great job. That's uncomfortable enough, but you might actually do the work thinking you do have all the context you need to do a great job, and you find out only later that you didn't. Your customer was unhappy, wasn't delighted by what you delivered, and your organization isn't thrilled either. You made some decisions that were contrary to the policy, to the strategy of the business. So the context just wasn't there. So what do you do about it? Well, I'm going to show you something. You may hate me for this afterwards. This is one of these things that once you see, you can't unsee. So brace yourself. I want you to think about every vertical line here as representing a relationship. A relationship not just between activities, not just handovers between activities, for example, but as a relationship between all the process that goes before and all the process that goes after. I'm going to stress that word again, relationship, not just a flow, but a relationship where things happening on either side of that relationship can influence the other side. And there's a whole load of dysfunctions that can take place in any of these relationships. I've summarized them in 18 words. This is like the Uber dysfunction, one side doing what might be better done by the other, or in collaboration, or deferred until needed. Now, there's quite a powerful idea that I credit Philippe Gouenet, known to some of us here. Philippe invites us to think about, well, for this relationship, in fact, not just only for this relationship in general, but for this specific piece of work, should we coordinate, cooperate, or collaborate? So should we coordinate, just let the board do the job, as long as we can see the work flowing across the board, everyone's happy. Cooperate, do we need to break this down a bit? Do we need to agree some synchronization points, some integration points, and so on? Or do we need to collaborate? If this work's going to be successful, it needs to come out of a creative relationship between both sides. And the way to actually get this right is to have that conversation at the beginning of the work. If you think about the three amigos practice, development, product, assurance, getting together at the beginning of a piece of work, traditionally just to make sure that we know what done looks like, but also making sure that we've agreed whether we're coordinating, cooperating, collaborating, making sure that every potentially problematic relationship is represented in that conversation. And that may include some representation from perhaps a higher level scale, some strategy input, so that we don't make some policy mistakes as we're delivering that piece of work. And then at the end of the work, part of our learning is about reflecting on, well, did we make the right decision? Were we right just to coordinate, or should we have cooperated or collaborated? Or were actually cooperation and collaboration too expensive for something where we could have just let the system do the work for us? Now, this may put you in mind of Cynefin. Is this a clear, understandable piece of work? Well, probably it's enough to coordinate. Is it a complicated piece of work? Bit of expertise, bit of analysis required? Well, perhaps we're going to need to cooperate on this piece of work. Is this a complex piece of work? Well, we can't be sure of what the impact will be of any piece of work that we do. We're going to need to try multiple things. We're going to need to iterate. You know, those smell of complexity there. Or perhaps you just don't know. You don't understand the problem well enough even to have that conversation. Well, you need to go back, probe a bit more, find out a bit more, get a bit more context, and then have a more proactive conversation about your interaction style. How are you going to manage that relationship? And as I said, you're going to hate me for this. Every vertical line and the relationships between scale, there are opportunities for failures of context. But make sure we're having those conversations. Use Philippe's trick. Coordinate, cooperate, collaborate. Have the conversation about what's the appropriate style to use. And through that conversation, establish the context you need to do a great job, or at least know that you're going to need to proceed in such a way that will gather the context, create the context as you go. So just to wrap up, start where you are. This is not a design to roll out. This is a set of tools that you can use where you are, in your scope, in your networks, at the scale you best understand, structuring, translating, reconciling, connecting. So structuring, making sure you understand the who, where, what, and when of your customers, more broadly of your environment, of your challenges, and so on. Translating ends before means, outcomes before solutions. We're getting agenda shifty here, agreement on outcomes before solutions, authentic agreement, the right people in the room, outcomes expressed in people's own words, people already motivated to find solutions that fit, that help deliver those outcomes. Very different from the rollout. Reconciling, find the meaning. I mean, we could do a talk just on meaning, couldn't we? But here, this is the meaning. What does this surprise mean to us? Is a good place to start. What does it mean for us? What does it mean for others? And lastly, for context, be a keeper of context. Notice when people don't have the context they need to do a great job. Notice when a conversation is struggling for lack of context. Now, you may be in a position to provide that context. I'm not saying not to, but I'm going to ask you to do something else or something additional. And that's to look back. How did we get to a point? How did we get to this point without this context? What was the conversation that didn't happen? What does that say about our process? Or how are we insulating people from the context they need to do a great job? And that may say something about your organization structure or your role design, you know, that's depriving people of the context that they need to do a great job. So start where you are, from your scopes, in your networks, at the scale you best understand, doing those things with all the opportunities your scope and your networks afford you. And then the fun starts. Well, the fun starts when everybody else is doing it. You know, this is what a really adaptive organization looks like. Now, I put something else on LinkedIn the last week or two, you know, where I said, so wouldn't it be good if we redefine continuous, not as in tiny increments or infinitesimally small, mathematically small increments. I am a mathematician, by the way, but rather that it's happening everywhere all the time. And most people got it, but for some people, it's just throw their hands up in horror. Surely that's a recipe for chaos. Actually, it is so much easier to change things when there's change happening around you. And some of the mechanisms I've described help with that, you know, that reconciling, that translating, those sort of things, for example, help you change as other things are changing around you. Change is an opportunity. So when other people around you, other scopes around you are starting where they are doing these things, that's when the fun starts. That's the formal end of the talk. I just want to say, just to remind you about that page, if you've been affected by any of the issues raised in this program, structures that don't seem to fit, the wrong things managed in the wrong places from above or from below, where strategy is something that happens to you, not something that you own for your scope, own collectively for your scope, that you participate in for scopes and scales around you, disappointed customers, disappointed organization because you didn't have the context that you need. Those are the issues that we've dealt with. So it's all there at agendashift.com/keynotes. You can get a PDF of the slides there, references, some of the books I've referenced. I mentioned Stafford Beer and the viable system model. You have to read something like 1,000 pages of Stafford Beer to get it. You need to read the 1,000 pages before you can understand his 50-page book. This is why I worked hard on making this stuff accessible, and I plan to write a book of my own when I finish book 4. That's a whole another story. But I do plan to write a book on this stuff. It's not actually that difficult, and it can be done in a way that fits well with 21st century sensibilities, lean and agile sensibilities, complexity aware sensibilities, and so on. And I actually think the agile world needs it. I think scaling agile, scaling anything, scaling process without an appreciation of how organizations really work, how they need to work, how they get healthy, how they get unhealthy, how they adapt and learn, I actually think that is a bit dangerous. And I think this needs to be done. And I think we need more practitioners who have, not just from this model, but from other models as well, a better sensitivity to organizational issues. Of all the things you could look to scale, process is probably the hardest. And it's not where I would start. I'll just leave it there as my final comment on the scaling frameworks. Some other goodies for you. Assessment tools. We're quite well known for our assessment tools, of outcome-oriented, non-prescriptive assessment tools, friendly language, and all these things. We've recently done a quite big iteration on our one on the adaptive organization, and there's a mini version of that you can try, just for free. You can just try. There's some information about the leading with outcomes modules. It's the 4th of the 4 is the adaptive organization. All the stuff I talked about outcomes, that's the other 3, and about strategy, inside out strategy, outside in strategy, and so on. And if you're interested in using the facilitation tools or teaching this stuff, then we have programs for that as well. Just quickly, on the 15th, we have Klaus actually visiting us as a guest at our regular meetup webinar and Ask Me Anything session. Instead of asking me anything, we can ask Klaus anything instead. Klaus is aware of this stuff, and we are, we're encouraging each other with this. I'm a big fan of flight levels. Klaus understands what I'm doing here as well, and I'm looking forward to a really interesting conversation with him on the 15th. Next Train the Trainers are the 16th. That's a week today that starts, and in June there's a 3-day event, 1 day of foundation and 2 days of adaptive organization in person in London. My first public in-person workshop since COVID, so quite exciting. And you don't need to do all 3 days either. So take a look at that. But if this adaptive organization stuff is piquing your interest, then that will be a very good opportunity to explore it with some other people. I will leave it there. Agendashift.com/keynotes, and I'll be very happy to take questions. Thank you very much for listening.